Alright, it's time for this month's reading vlog. I got through a lot of classics this month and I'm looking forward to talking about them. First up, we've got Brighton Rock by Greene, published in 1938. Brighton Rock is the story of a gang of mobsters led by a 17-year-old boy called Pinky. It starts with the murder of a former member called Fred, who gets killed by Pinky for betraying the gang in events prior to the story. Before he dies, he spends the day with a young woman called Ida Arnold, and she turns detective after his murder and tries to work out what's going on, while the gang starts to fall apart as they're doing their best to avoid being caught for the killing. This is just a really good thriller and I really enjoyed it. I've actually known about this book for a very long time because it gets referenced in one of my favourite Morrissey songs, Now My Heart Is Full, and so I always wanted to read it, but I've only just got round to it. And I'm glad that I finally did because I thought it was great. Greene has a really accessible writing style, the story is really engaging all the way through, the characters are really well drawn, and even though it's a story about mobsters, it doesn't rely on too many of the standard mobster tropes that you might expect. This is definitely true of the female characters, who play significant parts in the action in the story. It actually reminded me a lot of A Secret History by Donna Tartt. Both of these stories centre on a friendship group who commit a murder, and then for the rest of the story we watch as this friendship group dissolves. Although Donna Tartt's story is set in a university and is a lot more intellectual and a much bigger book than Brighton Rock, which is a thriller and a lot shorter, but still none the worse for it. Also, one thing that surprised me about this book was I didn't actually know when it was written. I assumed because it was something in a Morrissey song that it must have been written around the time of the 90s, and it sort of does feel like it could have been written in the 90s. Aside from some obvious references, like references to vinyl records which do date it, the actual prose style is incredibly modern, and that really surprised me then when I found out this was published in 1938. And I always like that in a story when you can get a story that just comes across as completely timeless, and usually that's quite hard to do when you're going back, nearly 100 years now, 1938. So yeah, fantastic story, a great thriller, very short, very enjoyable, and I couldn't recommend that one enough. Next up we have another thriller, but of a more psychological style this time, and that is Margaret Atwood's first novel, Surfacing, which was published in 1972. Surfacing tells the story of an unnamed female narrator, and in the story she goes back to her hometown in Canada shortly after she's lost her mother, and now her father has disappeared and she's going back home to find him. She ends up on this island where the family have a little property where they used to spend their holidays when she was a child, because that's where her father was last seen. And throughout the story she explores her childhood, her inner demons and turmoils, and things get pretty crazy towards the end, but I won't spoil exactly how they get crazy. I really enjoyed Surfacing, although I have to say it wasn't what I was expecting because I only know Margaret Atwood through her science fiction with The Handmaid's Tale, which I haven't actually read. This is the first Atwood story that I've read. That said, it is a really good story. At the beginning you have these characters, the female narrator and her companions, and they all seem reasonably nice, intellectual city types, and then they go to this secluded place, and slowly their personalities start to crumble as it's revealed that they're all pretty terrible people in very different ways. What I like about the story though is that Atwood, again, she doesn't rely too much on cliches. There are lots and lots of layers to these characters, and so when you find out one thing about them you think, oh, so that's what's driving you. But then you find out that there's something else even deeper within the character, and the story pretty much progresses like this until all of the characters, especially the narrator, are completely broken down. If I was to criticise the novel at any one point though, it would be that I do think that the ending itself is a little bit too quick. It's one of those stories that has a fantastic build-up. It's really tense all the way through. It's told from a first-person perspective in the present tense, so it's really engaging and thrilling, but then it just kind of speeds up at the end and then finishes. And so I wasn't too keen on the ending, but overall it was still a very good tense thriller, and if you like psychological stories that really focus on people's inner demons, then you'll definitely enjoy Surfacing. Next up we have The Bell by Iris Murdoch, which was published in 1958. So I read this one for the book club that I'm in, and this is the second time we've actually picked a Murdoch novel, and I have to say I enjoyed this one a lot more than I enjoyed the first one, Under the Net. I did enjoy Under the Net, I just thought that The Bell was even better. So The Bell centres on a cast of characters who all live in this secluded religious community set in this big country house somewhere in Gloucestershire. It's a really hard novel to summarise easily in terms of the characters and the main plot, because it's one of those stories that really is about the characters, and there are many characters, and their individual stories allow Murdoch to explore many themes. But if I was to sum the story up, I'd say it's mainly a story about isolation and retreat. All of the characters in the story are in some sense retreating into this religious lay community where they can be secluded from the outside world, and through the course of the story they realise that they can't do this because the demons that they've projected out there into the world are actually inside them and are going to come back and haunt them in the end. And there are lots of inner demons in this book. You've got broken marriages and relationships, you've got people having inner turmoils with their sexuality, and lots of mental health problems, as well as religious themes, people having crises of religion and atheism and all that stuff. So there's a lot going on in these characters. What I like about Murdoch, and it's true of The Bell, and it's also true of Under the Net, is that she manages to tackle some pretty serious subject matter, but also still be entertaining. She's really witty and she's really funny, and she has a knack for putting characters in really silly situations which are really entertaining to read. Also, her characters are always really well drawn. They often have flaws, and some of their flaws end up being quite substantial, but sometimes they're just silly flaws which make for very amusing situations. For example, one of the characters, Dora, is very much a cosmopolitan, city-loving kind of girl, and she comes into this religious lay community and she doesn't like it, and sometimes she has very harsh words to say about people, and it's just really funny to have those little character moments that Murdoch does so well. Also, historically, this is quite an interesting and significant book. It came out a year after the Wolfden Report in the United Kingdom, which was a report which for the first time recommended to the government that homosexual acts be decriminalised, at least if they're between private consenting adults. And this was also the first novel of Murdoch's to contain homosexual characters, and after this point all of her books would contain at least one gay character going forward. And what I like about the way that Murdoch presents sexuality in her books is that she doesn't make a big sensation about it. It's not some big aspect of someone's personality and that's all there is to them. It's just one dimension of their character, and it causes them some problems, of course it does, but it's not everything to do with their character. She just presents it in a very natural way, which is really good and very modern for the time. I would say though that The Bell is a slow burner of a book. If you don't like character-based novels that move along quite slowly, then you might not get a lot out of The Bell. It's certainly not as action-packed as Brighton Rock or Surfacing. It's a much slower novel. The tension is much more subdued, but it's really enjoyable, and Murdoch just does an excellent job of exploring characters and their various dimensions. Overall then, just another fantastic book, which I seem to have read quite a lot of this month. Next up we have The Tempest by William Shakespeare. So for those of you who watch my vlogs regularly will know that I'm doing a Shakespeare reading challenge this year, and this month we got The Tempest. This was actually a surprise choice of mine because when I did the reading plan for the Shakespeare challenge, I actually skipped May, so there wasn't actually a Shakespeare play picked for May, and so I got to choose The Tempest, which was great because I kind of wanted to do The Tempest anyway, but ended up picking different plays. So that was a nice treat. And I'm really glad that I picked it because it didn't disappoint me either. The Tempest tells the story of Prospero, who is a magician who's stranded on an island. He's been put there because he was usurped from his rightful throne by, I think, his brother Antonio. And now he's on this island and he's stayed there for a long time until one day he manages to get the people that usurped him to crash their ship into the island, and he can have his mischievous revenge. Of the Shakespeare plays that I've read this year, The Tempest might just be my favourite. I do really like Antony and Cleopatra, but I think that is more to do with the characters, whereas with The Tempest it's about the characters and the story, so for me this one wins out over Antony and Cleopatra a little bit. It's a really good blend of comedy and tragedy, and I really like the fantastical elements in it, sort of like Midsummer Night's Dream kind of vibes, and I really like the Midsummer Night's Dream, so it's no wonder that I also like The Tempest. Unfortunately, I don't have much to say about the play because I did read this pretty much on the first day of the month, and so my brain has died and I've basically forgotten most of what happened in it. But I would definitely like to find a production and watch it, because usually what I do with my Shakespeare reading challenge is I read the play, then I watch it, and that usually helps me fill in the blanks from reading it, because Shakespeare, hard to understand, and then I go back and read it afterwards. But I've not done that yet with The Tempest, so I'll be doing that soon, and hopefully I might have a bit more to say about it in the future. But yeah, fantastic play, and if you haven't checked out The Tempest, I would definitely recommend it. And now on to the last book that I read this month, and that is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, published in 1927. Now I did review this one more in depth on my channel, so I won't go too much into it here, but I'll just give a bit of a synopsis and my general thoughts of the book, because I did read it this month. The story takes place over 2 trips that a family make to their lovely coastal cottage on the Isle of Skye, once before World War I and once after World War I. And then there's a passage in the middle that deals with the time that's passed in between these two visits. And if that sounds boring, that's because what makes the story interesting is not the plot, but the characters and their minds. Virginia Woolf writes in a stream of consciousness style, which means that her aim with her prose is to capture the way that the human mind thinks, and she does this really well. It can be a bit of a confusing read, especially in the first part, because you have a lot more characters in that bit, and Woolf has this tendency to jump between different characters, sometimes in the space of a sentence, so it can be really hard to follow. But if you just sit back, read it, don't think about taking everything in, it's a very enjoyable book, and it's in some sense quite easy to read if you're not focusing on trying to understand everything and just kind of getting the general essence of what's being said. My favourite parts about the story are the ways in which Woolf is able to show how people present this picture of themselves externally. So some of the characters seem really stern and strong from the outside, but then on the inside they're incredibly insecure and weak and fragile. And then you have other characters who from the outside seem weak, passive, maybe even stupid, but then on the inside they have this rich intellectual life that no one else knows about because it's just going on in their heads. And Woolf does a really good job of showing these two sides of people. I also really like the second part of the book, which isn't told from the stream of consciousness perspective, but instead it's told from the perspective of the Ramsay house that they stay in on the beach in the war period. And in this war period, they don't visit the house all. There are lots of tragedies that happen to the family during this time, and we just watch as the house slowly crumbles because there's no one there to give it the attention that it needs, aside from a housekeeper who's a bit of a thief and not a very nice person. Overall, just a wonderful story. If you haven't read any Virginia Woolf, I would definitely recommend starting with To the Lighthouse, or maybe Mrs. Dalloway, but my preference is certainly for To the Lighthouse, because I just think it's perfect. Alright, that's it for all the books that I read this month. Again, it was another classics heavy month, but I am slowly getting through the classics on my reading pile, and I should be getting back into some more gothic and fantasy books soon, so if you prefer me talking about those, don't worry, they'll be coming back. Let me know what you think of the books that I've mentioned this week, and also if you have any book recommendations, please feel free to leave them in the comments because I always appreciate them. But that's it for this video. Take care everyone. Ta-ra.